All right, once again, good afternoon. This is Bonnie McFarland. I'd like to welcome you to our annual Equitable Services Workshop. And joining me today are Rachel Garcia and Adrienne Balcazar. And we'll be taking a look today at the federal requirements for providing equitable services to eligible nonprofit private schools. And since the consultation process for next year should be underway at this time, we usually provide a workshop just about now as a reminder and update on some of the requirements. There's a link to the PowerPoint presentation in the chat, so you can access that. And just a reminder before we get started, I think there was a note on the flyer, but in case you missed it, the equitable services requirement only applies to school districts. It does not apply to charter schools. That's because only school districts have district boundaries, and most of the requirements for private school services are based on school district boundaries. So charter schools, if we have charter school folks, then you get the gift of time, and this won't be applying to you. But for the rest of you, welcome, and we'll take a look at the next slide, which is just a reminder to put your questions in the chat. We'll try to address them as we go through today's session, but if we, in many cases, we either run out of time or don't have the clarity in the answer that you want at this time, we'll follow up with a Q&A email. So let's take a look at our outcomes for today, and we're going to be focusing on the district role and responsibilities for equitable services. And that includes requirements related to the design, the implementation, and the evaluation of program services and fiscal control of the program and program funds. We'll also spend some time looking at how to determine the proportional share for individual programs, which varies by program. And consultation is a critical piece of the requirements for equitable services. So we're going to spend a considerable amount of time looking at the consultation requirements, which are specified in law. And finally, we'll leave you with some places to go for additional resources and support. And speaking of that, we have a handbook available through our website, and it's available through our ordering office. And this provides general information on all ESSA programs. It provides basic Q&As to get you started. Where do I go? How do I find the list of private schools that are eligible? EDGAR requirements, which are the Education Department regulations, steps for developing programs with your private schools, and information about fiscal requirements and documentation. It also includes a section for each of the individual programs. We're in the midst of updating that binder, and it's going to be ready soon, but we do have our current binder available. If you wish to order it, you can do so, and if you order it now, we will get you a copy of the updated one, of course at no charge when that comes out, if you just missed that. So if you're anxious to get started, feel free to go ahead and order, and we'll make sure you get the new one as soon as it's hot off the press. Also included in that handbook is a flash drive, and that flash drive provides a number of support materials, documents that you can use throughout the consultation process. So that is also part of that. And ordering information is on the link at the bottom of the page. All right, so let's take a look at how we got here. A question we often get is, why are we providing services for private schools? How did that come about? And there's a long history to it. And we share this because it's helpful for you to understand. Sometimes you'll see something happening, you're not sure why that's happening, and it could be just past practice that's based on something that may have changed in the past. And actually, sometimes you walk into a job and people keep doing things the way it's always been done. So I find it helpful just to go through, first of all, how we got here. And how we got here started way back 1965, when the Elementary and Secondary Act was first authorized. And that was one of the hallmarks of President Lyndon Johnson's administration. It was part of the War on Poverty program. And as a result, it was a high priority for him, but it ran into some roadblocks at the time. And one of those was over services to private schools. And the roadblocks came in from two groups. One was the teachers' unions and organizations who were opposed to providing funding to private schools, and the other were various private school organizations and church groups who wanted to ensure and said they would block the legislation as best they could if they weren't included. So Secretary of Education his name was Keppel at the time. He came up with a compromise, and that's what we're living with today is Keppel's compromise. And that compromise was that the funding would not go to private schools. So you'll find that as a basis in a lot of things we're talking about today. No funds go to the private schools. However, the children received services, children attending private schools who are eligible. So services go to students and teachers in private schools, but funding does not. And that was the compromise that got the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act approved. It ran into a number of roadblocks through the way, as you might imagine, with church-state issues. And the first was what we call the Lemon Test. And that was based on the Establishment Clause that the government should not establish a religion. And based on that, there was a lawsuit, Lemon versus Kurtzman. And the result of that came out with what they called the Lemon Test, which was a three-pronged test that services had to be secular, they could not advance or inhibit religion, and there should be no entanglement of government agencies with the religious organizations. In 1985, we had another court case, Grand Rapids School District versus Ball. And in that case, they found that the Grand Rapids School District program did not meet the test 3, which was the entanglement test. And that had to do because teachers were going in and actually teaching courses in the private schools, and they felt that that was entangled with the religious organization in that school. So then in the same year, we have one of the big cases that if you know the history of equitable services, you would know Aguilar and Felton and Agostini versus Felton. These are two key cases that sort of reversed each other. Aguilar versus Felton prohibited services on site of private schools. So teachers and staff were not allowed to go on the private school site. And that was huge for districts. And there's a few districts that still have some old portable buildings left or trailers that they used to house the Title I program at that time. And that went on for about 10 years till 1997 when Agostini versus Felton reversed that and allowed public school teachers to go on the campuses of private schools to provide services. The next things that sort of came up were, one was concerns with consultation. Consultation became a big issue with the Department of Education. They were seeing that consultation wasn't taking place appropriately, and that basically school districts were offering services to private school children, but they weren't consulting with the private school in that process. They were just offering the district program. In 2010, the United States Department of Education did a review of California's programs, and they found several issues that became a focus of a lot of things probably you're working with. One was the district control of the program. They found that districts were not maintaining control of the program and services, which is a requirement. The other had to do with determining the equitable share, that districts were not determining that accurately. And the next, we'll talk about later all of these, but the next one has to do with providing benefit to the private school. Services cannot benefit the private school, only the students. And evaluations were not taking place, and selection criteria was not effective. So a lot of problems specific to California in 2010 were identified. Then in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act made some additional changes to the Title I formula, added some requirements for consultation. It clarified some of the carryover requirements, and it added the state ombudsman, which we're going to look at now. The ombudsman was added to ensure that private school children, teachers, and other personnel received the services equitably in comparison to the public schools. And essentially, they're sort of the go-between between the private school and the school districts when there are issues, questions, or disputes. And our ombudsman is Sylvia Hanna, and she can be reached at this email address, and she's the person to contact if you have questions or if you anticipate a problem or you aren't sure of something. Good person to contact just to check on it. There's also an ombudsman's webpage, and it provides you program contacts for all the programs. Sylvia Hanna primarily works with Title I programs, but there are specific consultants on that page who can assist you with other programs. So that's a helpful link. Next, we'll take a look at what are equitable services. What does this mean? And first of all, you'll see in bold, it's a district program, and we're going to hear that over and over again. This is not a private school program, it's your district program, and it's provided to students and teachers in eligible nonprofit private schools. So we'll be taking a look at how you identify eligible schools, and nonprofit status is key to that. So a district program provided to students and teachers in eligible schools from federal education funds. This only applies to ESSA. State funds are not subject to equitable services. So what are the programs? On the next slide, we'll see a list. These are all the programs, and we'll talk about each of them later, or Rachel and Adrian will be talking about each of them. And the requirements differ for various programs, but all of these programs in the Every Student Succeeds Act are subject to the equitable services provisions. You'll notice Title IV Part B is different from the others because it's a competitive grant program. So in some cases, those programs are eligible too. The next slide talks about the focus, and this we'll spend a lot more time on as we go through today's presentation. But the requirements for each of the programs should be the focus of what the services are. And the focus should be on how you're developing either a program or how you're providing the services. The bottom line is you don't start with the funding, you start with what's the program going to be and what are the services, and that's where consultation starts. So for Title I, you look at the purpose of Title I, right? Increasing academic achievement for low-performing students. So what's the Title I program going to be for eligible students and parents in the private schools? For Title II, what services will be offered to supplement the private school's professional development program based on the needs of students? Title III, you're looking at what services are provided to EL and immigrant students. What are the needs for services and what are those services? And that's where it should start, just like your public school program. And then the same with Title IV, looking at the allowable areas under Title IV. Just one last reminder, and that will be, we'll be talking about this a lot later because this is an area of much confusion. Title I requirements are significantly different than for the other titles, 2, 3, and 4. And Title I, if you think about your district program, Title I is a school-based program. So funding and services are based on the student's residence rather than where the school is located. And we'll walk through what that looks like a little bit later. But think about title school. If a child was going to a Title I school, they would receive those services. So it's based on where the child lives. That is the only program that operates that way. Okay? So you may have to serve students who are attending schools outside your district boundaries if they live in the boundary of a Title I funded school. Titles 2, 3, and 4 are very different. They only apply to eligible private schools located within your district boundaries. So it's a totally different funding model for each of those and service model. A reminder about your old 2020 CARES Act funds. If you were around in 2020, you might recall all the confusion that surrounded equitable services under the CARES Act. That was the first ed relief funds that came out, and that was ESSER and GEAR, ESSER 1 and GEAR 1. And for each of those programs, there was a requirement to provide equitable services to private nonprofit schools in the district boundaries. So that was in 2020. And subsequent, there was such confusion over it, I think was the reason that subsequent ed relief funds, ESSER 2 and 3, eliminated that requirement for LEAs. Instead, they have a separate program, and that's that EAMS program, Equitable Services, which is operated by the state. So the State Department of Education provides services, and private schools need to work with the state on those programs. So LEAs are not required to provide equitable services under ESSER 2 or 3, only ESSER 1. That was your 2020 funds that are about to expire. So the next slide, just a reminder, if you have any remaining funds that you reserved out of that ESSER 1 and GEAR 1 back in 2020, if you reserved funds, but those funds are still unspent, the amount you didn't spend, then you have a responsibility to ensure those funds are carried over specifically for services to private schools, eligible nonprofit private schools, by the end of this year, because the grant, those funds expire September 30th of this year. Okay. So they have the same requirements as other programs we'll talk about here, but just make sure those funds get expended, and the other ESSER programs, there's no equitable services requirement. All right, so that's just kind of an overview, and we're going to dig in now a little bit deeper, and I'm going to turn over to Rachel, who's going to talk about one of the crucial part of equitable services and implementation, evaluation, planning, and that's consultation. So Rachel, take it away.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Bonnie mentioned, now we'll be taking a look at the consultation process. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an overview of the consultation process and the components that we'll be taking a look at in this section. And consultation involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. And it's important to note that the consultation process is the responsibility of the district. And the goal is agreement between the district and private school officials on how to provide equitable and effective programs for eligible private school students, teachers, and families. Next slide, please. So the first step in the process is identifying eligible private schools. And only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to the CDE may participate in equitable services. There are two ways to access the list of eligible private schools. And the first link provided on the slide will take you to the CDE website, where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. And the second link is a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools within district boundaries. A county password is required to access the database, and the password for LA County is listed on the slide. Other counties must contact the CDE private school office for their specific county password. And we've also heard that the CDE updates this list in March. So if you've already checked the list or database to get started on the consultation process for next year's services, it'll be important to check it again just to see if any new schools were added to the list. And one other thing to keep in mind is that the CDE does not verify the accuracy of information on affidavits. The CDE expects districts to verify the accuracy of student enrollment data and tax-exempt status through the consultation process. And this expectation is noted on the Consolidated Application Nonprofit Private School Consultation page that gets submitted in the spring release. Next slide, please. So in terms of private school participation, the requirements for Title I Part A, as Bonnie mentioned, are different than that of the other programs. So they're different than the Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4. For Title I Part A, nonprofit private schools, both within and outside of the district's boundaries, may be eligible to participate because funding and services are based on the student's residence in a Title I school attendance area. For Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries may participate. Next slide, please. So once you've identified eligible nonprofit private schools, you must contact them to inform them of the programs and services for which their students, teachers, and families may be eligible. And as previously mentioned, consultation with nonprofit private schools is a district responsibility. So it's up to the district to initiate contact with the private schools, and this is something that must be done on an annual basis. It's recommended that districts reach out to eligible private schools around January or February to begin consultation early enough to prepare for the next year, and also so that services are implemented in a timely manner. Most districts use some sort of invitation letter or an intent to participate letter to initiate this contact with the private schools. And in this letter, you would include a brief description of the applicable programs for which your district participates, and may also request that the private school indicates their intent to participate in any or all applicable programs. You would then follow up with an informational meeting regarding the programs and consultation process. Another important thing to note is that if you don't receive a response from private school officials, you should follow up with the private school and maintain documentation of the multiple attempts to contact the private school officials. And so if you send letters or communication, you want to be sure to send it by certified mail, or if you're sending emails, you want to send it with a red receipt to document that it was received by the private school official. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's sample intent to participate letter, as well as a link to access this document. The consultation process is initiated annually when the LEA reaches out to private schools to explain the intent and purposes of the applicable federal programs that their students and staff may be eligible to participate in. And again, as mentioned, most districts use an intent to participate letter to initiate this contact. It's also important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, whether or not they intend to participate in equitable services. And you may also include a deadline by which the private school needs to respond and identify any potential consequences for not meeting this deadline. You would then begin the consultation process with private schools that have indicated their intent to participate. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the intent to participate letter should be followed up with an informational meeting to provide more specific information about the programs that private school students, teachers, and families may be eligible to participate in, as well as the procedures for participating. So some of the topics that could be addressed at this initial meeting are listed on the slide. So for example, it will be important to explain the consultation process and the required topics that must be addressed. Other possible topics include explaining the purpose of the federal programs available and the services allowed under each program. Also explaining that the district is responsible for developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the programs. and providing funding estimates for the next school year, as well as the process that will be used to determine private school participants' equitable share. Also providing information on district policies and procedures, such as contracts and encumbrance deadlines, verifying the name and contact information for the private school official designated to represent the school, and then finally scheduling future meetings and timelines for consultation. And so it's important to remember that it's about designing an equitable and effective program for eligible students, teachers, and families, and not about the private school just sending the district a list of items or services that they wish to obtain. So you want to set the tone and convey this message at this initial meeting. Next slide, please. So in order to ensure that consultation with private school officials is timely and meaningful, it must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. And so consultation must occur during the design and development of programs, and before the district makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. And consultation must also be ongoing throughout the year to ensure effective implementation, as well as the evaluation of services. It's also important to keep in mind that a unilateral offer of services by a district with no opportunity for discussion is not adequate consultation. So effective consultation provides an opportunity for all parties to express their views and to also have those views considered. Next slide, please. So here is a sample private school consultation timeline that has been adapted from a sample CDE timeline. And the link to the CDE sample is included at the bottom of the slide for your reference. If you take a look at February, you'll see that it is suggested that LEAs begin evaluating the current programs and services being provided to private school participants, and also begin the consultation process for next year's services. So you can see that at certain times during the year, districts are consulting with private school officials on both the current year programs and services, as well as the next year's programs and services. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, consultation involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials. And there are specific topics that must be addressed under ESEA. The topics listed on this slide are required for all federal programs. So through the consultation process, districts and private school officials will need to discuss how the private school students' needs will be identified, what services will be offered, and how, where, and by whom will they be provided. Also, how will the services be assessed, and how will those results be used to improve services? The size and scope of services, including the equitable share, and how that amount is determined, and also how and when the district will make decisions about the delivery of services. Next slide, please. So here we see additional required consultation topics. And the 3 in the red area are again required for all federal programs. And the 3 topics in the pink area are only applicable to Title I. So for all federal programs, consultations will also need to address how disagreements will be addressed in writing. So if the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on any topic discussed during consultation, the LEA must provide in writing to the private school official the reasons why it disagrees. Consultation must also address whether the LEA will provide services directly or through a contract with a third-party provider, and whether to provide equitable services by pooling funds or on a school-by-school basis. It's important to note that the LEA and private school officials must agree to the pooling funds through consultation, and LEAs may not unilaterally make the decision to pool funds. So for Title I only, consultation will also need to address the method that will be used to determine low-income children, when services will be provided, including the approximate time of day, and whether to consolidate Title I equitable services funds with funds available under other programs. Another important thing to keep in mind is that this does not mean that LEAs are able to consolidate funds across programs, but rather coordinate the use of funds to maximize services. Next slide, please. Districts must maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and that it has provided equitable services. And so this documentation, it includes intent to participate letters, written affirmations of consultation, and also evidence of consultation attempts. Other documentation that must be maintained includes meeting agendas and minutes, any written explanations of disagreements, data collected to assess or evaluate services, service agreements or contract with any third-party providers, monitoring and assessment tools, also inventory records of any materials, property, or equipment purchased, and then also the identification criteria for student eligibility for Title I services. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's written affirmation and also the link to access it on the CDE website. So as mentioned, LEAs are required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. And private school officials must also have the option to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred, or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. So you want to be sure that this is included on the form, especially if you don't use the CDE sample. And this information is then reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page with the spring CONAP submission. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the nonprofit private school consultation page from last spring's CONAP. So you can see here that LEAs were asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation occurred, also if consultation agreement was met, if there was a signed written affirmation on file, and then also a consultation code indicating the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. So as you're beginning the consultation process with private schools for next year's programs and services, keep in mind that you'll be reporting this information to the CDE this spring. And one other important reminder is that you'll want to maintain documentation from private schools that decline services, and also documentation of attempts at consultation with those private schools that don't respond to you. Next slide, please. So here are just a few final consultation reminders. Consultation really is key to implementing effective programs. It must be timely and meaningful, and again, take place before the LEA makes any decisions. It must also be ongoing throughout the year to help ensure effective implementation and also evaluation of equitable services. And again, the goal of all parties should be to reach an agreement, and all agreements should be clear, in writing, and form the basis of services to be provided and funds to be expended. Effective consultation serves to ensure that the services provided meets the needs of eligible students, teachers, and families. And it also helps to avoid any last-minute spending requests from private schools. And that concludes my section, so I will now turn it over to Adrienne.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. Now we're going to take a look at Equitable Share. Under ESSA, Section 8501A4, Equitable Share ensures that there is the equitable participation of private school students, teachers, and families. These services are considered to be equitable when the district meets the expenditure requirements of the federal program and the district provides a program that meets the educational needs of the participants. It must also be equitable in comparison to the services and other benefits that the district is providing for their own students. In the Title I program, equitable services for the private schools are based on this equitable share. The equitable share must be equal to the proportion of funds allocated to the participating school attendance areas based on the number of children from the low-income families who attend private schools. There are specific methods that must be followed in determining the Title I funding. In determining the proportional share or funding, the method for determining the proportional share depends on the federal program, as stated earlier. The methodology for Title I program is significantly different from the other programs, and it often is confusing because for Title I, the proportional share is based on where the student lives. Here are some key points about the funding for Title I equitable services. First of all, proportional share must be calculated from the total amount of the Title I allocation that the district receives. It must be taken off the top first and then set aside for equitable services. The funds must be also used to implement the Title I program in the same fiscal year that the district receives them. And you can verify this on the Con app. Another key point is that the state, which is the California Department of Education, they have a requirement that they must notify the private schools of the allocation of funds that the district has determined for equitable share. So here are the steps to be taken in order to determine the Title I proportional share. First, you need to identify the private school students who will generate the funding. You will also need to know who are the low-income families in the eligible private schools within your district and the adjoining districts. Next, you'll need to consult with the private school in order to determine what will you use to measure the poverty. Here are some choices. One, you can use the same measure of low income used to count public school children. Often that is the free and reduced lunch meal process. Or you can use comparable data. Comparable data, this is often through the use of surveys, typically known as a poverty survey. And just note that if you use a survey, you're going to want to the extent possible, protect the identity of the families of private school students. So you may want to allow each survey to just extrapolate the data, when it's available and how it's available. The third way is proportionality, and here you would apply the low-income percentage of each participating Title I public school attendance area. And the last way, you can use an equated measure of low income that correlates with the measure of low income used to count public school children. After you have agreed on what measure of poverty you will use, you will need to collect the poverty data from the private school families. And then the poverty data will be needed to be filtered through in order to collect the number of students ages 5 through 17 who are from low-income families and attend the eligible private schools. Now that you have all your poverty data, you can determine the proportional share of funds reserved for the Title I services for private school students. First, you must determine the equitable services proportional percentage rate. To find this, you must divide the number of low-income private school students by the total number of public and private school students. Then you multiply the proportional percentage rate by your whole Title I Part A entitlement. And then this will give you the total proportional share available for services to eligible students in the participating private schools. Once you know how much you have for the private schools, now you must consult, as Rachel went over, with each of the private schools to determine the needs and services. And you will also need to include in this discussion, as Rachel stated, any option of pooling, coordination with other funds. This will need to be done during the consultation process. So here, the calculation proportional share is stated here in the CONAP. The Title I calculation of the proportional share is here in the screenshot of the private schools equitable services reservation page. This shows you what it looks like. The arrow is pointing to the field where the sum of public and non-public private school low-income students data is inputted. And here it will calculate the percentage rate. The next section of the private school equitable services reservation page from the CONAP is where you can find the proportional share or the dollar amount. This page will calculate the proportional share of your equitable services reservation. So here's a graphic that shows a visual description of who generates the Title I funding for the private schools. In the blue, this district has Title I schools and non-Title I schools within its district boundaries. Now, looking at the private schools, there are private schools whose physical location is within your district boundaries. And in the green, you can see other private schools adjoining or surrounding your district. Let's take a look at these 6 students. Let's say that they are all low poverty students. Students 1, 2, and 3 live in the attendance area of a school that is a Title I school. And students 4 through 6 live in the attendance area of a school that is not a Title I school. Let's see which students generate the Title I funds. So low poverty students 1, 2, and 3, who all live in the Title I school attendance area, they all will generate income because they live in a Title I school attendance area. All 3 of these low poverty students will generate funding no matter which private school they attend. Remember, where the students reside is what determines whether they generate funding for the private school. Now let's look at the poverty students, numbers 4, 5, and 6. They all happen to live in a non-Title I school attendance area. All 3 of these low poverty students will not generate any funding for the private school because they live in the attendance area of a non-Title I school. Additionally, you can see that surrounding district school down at the bottom will have some low poverty students that generate funding and other low poverty students that do not. Now that you have determined the Title I funding, who actually receives the academic services? So you must identify which students will receive the Title I services. ESSA and the Code of Regulation, Federal Regulation states that Title I services are for students attending participating nonprofit private schools identified by the LEA as failing or most at risk of failing, and they reside in the LEA participating school attendance area. It is these students that are eligible for equitable services. Here are some key reminders when identifying students for services. Remember, they must reside in the Title I attendance area. They must meet multiple educationally related objective criteria agreed to in consultation. And please be aware that there are some students that are automatically eligible, such as homeless, students at Head Start, Even Start, Title I Pre-K, migrant program, or children in a local institution for neglected or delinquent children, or youth attending a community day program for such children in the last 2 years. And lastly, it's important to remember that poverty is not a criteria for services. Now, when you are providing the Title I services, it must be based on a needs assessment and with consultation. Your Title I program is run using the Targeted Assistance School model, typically called the TAS. And if you're hiring your own district employees, it's important to remember that they must meet the state credential requirements. And remember, you are re-implementing your Title I program. You may not just provide materials and supplies. It's not a pot of money, it is a program. And just to clarify on the slide before, I meant to say the low income. So let's test your understanding. Who generates the funding and who receives services? So let's look at student 1. This student is a low-income student that lives in a Title I school attendance area and is high achieving. Do they generate funding? Yes. Do they receive Title I services? No. They are not failing or most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. What about student number 2? Excuse me. This student is a low-income student and does not live in a Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. Do they generate funding? No. Do they receive Title I services? No. And that's because they would not receive Title I services because based on where they live, they would not be attending a non-Title I, or they would be attending a non-Title I school. And student 3, this student is a high-income student that lives in a Title I school attendance area and is low achieving. Do they generate funding? No. But do they receive Title I services? Yes, because they are failing or at most at risk of failing as defined in ESSA and the Code of Federal Regulations. I want to point out too, as you look at the CONAP, at the bottom of the CONAP page for this parent, there is a parent engagement reservation. And so if you receive Title I Part A entitlement of over $500,000 or more, you must reserve at least 1% of that entitlement to provide the private school activities to those students that are participating in the nonprofit private schools. Those students and families do get to receive these family activities. And so in the CONAP, that's a must. You must reserve at least 1% if you are allocated 500,000 or more. And for those that are under that 500,000, CDE encourages you to, you may. So again, it's not a legal requirement. However, again, you want to provide a robust program for your students and parents and teachers at the school. And so now Rachel will explain Equitable Share on the other federal programs.
Thank you, Adrienne. So next we'll be taking a look at equitable services for Title I Part C and also Titles 2, 3, and 4. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, for Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within your district boundaries are eligible to participate in these programs. So for these programs, there is no requirement to contact private schools outside your district boundaries as you would for Title I Part A. Next slide, please. This graphic illustrates which private schools will be served by your district for Title I Part C and Titles 2, 3, and 4. So in this scenario, your district is in the blue area, and you have districts A, B, and C surrounding you in the green area. There are also a number of private schools all around. So which private schools would you need to reach out to? So again, since you are only required to serve private schools within your boundaries for these programs, you would only have to reach out to private schools 1 and 2 in this scenario. So the private schools in the blue area. This again is in contrast to Title I Part A, because as Adrian explained, with Title I Part A, you also reach out to private schools in surrounding districts because the services follow the students who reside in your district's Title I attendance areas, but may be attending schools outside of your district boundaries. Now we'll be taking a look at each of these programs. So next slide, please. So once again, Title I Part C is different from Title I Part A in that you're only required to provide services to eligible students attending private schools within your district boundaries. The CDE Migrant Education Program regions and also Migrant Education Program districts assist participating nonprofit private schools in identifying eligible migrant students. And Migrant Education Program funds are used to provide supplemental services or other benefits on an equitable basis to eligible migrant children and their teachers and other educational personnel. And like the other federal programs, these services must be determined through the consultation process and must also be based on the student's needs. And so on this slide, you can see a few examples of services and also allowable activities, such as after-school interventions, health services, parent workshops, and also professional development for teachers of eligible students. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title I Part C. And this provides a walkthrough of the steps for calculating the equitable share. So for Title I Part C, a per pupil amount is determined based on the district's total Title I Part C allocation and the number of migrant education program students enrolled in both the public and participating nonprofit private schools. Next slide, please. So now for Title II, the district may use funds to provide professional development activities for private school teachers, principals, and other instructional personnel to address the specific needs of their private school students. And so just a few important things to note, services provided must be allowable under Title II, and they must also be supplemental to the professional development provided by the private school. And then again, Title II services are determined through the consultation process and must also be based on a needs assessment. It's also important to note that the services must address the specific needs of the students enrolled in the private school and not just the general needs of the private school. And some examples of professional development activities are included on the slide. One of the questions that we often receive is whether or not Title II funds could be used to pay for credential coursework. And so we recommend being cautious with this. You would need to ensure that the coursework is tied to the professional development needs assessment and also the professional development plan. Another important reminder is that services must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. And that goes with all federal programs that private schools may be participating in. And so with Title II funds, one scenario to avoid is one in which the private school requests reimbursement for a conference that they already attended, or request late registration for an upcoming conference that was not discussed through the consultation process, nor was determined to meet specified needs. So the professional development plan for Title II equitable services should be intentionally planned in advance through the consultation process. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's method of calculating equitable services proportional share for Title II. And this document provides the steps for determining the equitable share for Title II, and it can be found on the CDE Ombudsman webpage at the link provided at the bottom of the slide. So for Title II equitable services, a per pupil amount is determined based on the district's total Title II allocation, less the administrative cost, and the total enrollment of all public and nonprofit private school students at participating nonprofit private schools. Next slide, please. So now we have Title III, Part A. So Title III, Part A has two parts: the Title III English Learner Program and the Title III Immigrant Program. So for the English Learner Program, the private school would administer the home language survey to students being considered for participation. And it should be the same version as the home language survey used by the school district. If a language other than English is indicated on the home language survey, then the district is required to administer an initial language assessment. And the district is responsible for the cost and oversight of this initial assessment. It's also important to note that the district cannot use the LCAP with private school students. The CDE website has a list of approved tests that may be used to assess the English language proficiency of private school students. However, any test that is mutually agreed upon during consultation that is valid and reliable for assessing English proficiency may be used. And then EL students at the private school must also be assessed annually to determine the continued eligibility for services. So private schools may be eligible to participate in the Title III Immigrant Program if the private school submitted the Student National Origin Report, also known as the SNOR, with the number of eligible immigrant students, and it is located within the boundaries of a district that is eligible for and receives funding for the immigrant student program. And private schools submit the SNOR report to the CDE via an online reporting system. As a side note, the count of immigrant students in districts is reported in CalPADS, not the SNOR. So just for private schools, it's through the SNOR. And then also for your reference, ESEA defines immigrant students as those students who are age 3 through 21, were not born in the US or US territories, and have been attending a school in the US for less than 36 cumulative months. And we've also included the links to the CDE web pages for additional information on equitable services for both the Title III English Learner and immigrant programs. Next slide, please. So Title III funds are meant to provide supplemental language instructional services for English learners and support for immigrant students. And so through the consultation process, the district and each private school will develop a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. And at a minimum, this MOU needs to describe the services and products to be provided, the estimated cost and dates of their provision. And we've also included the link to a CDE sample MOU for your reference. And then just a few examples of Title III services are included on the slide. So this may include assessing English learners, small group instruction, after-school tutoring, and also professional development for the teachers of English learner or immigrant students. But again, services need to be determined in consultation and also based on the needs of the students. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's method of calculating equitable services proportional share document for Title III. And for Title III, the proportional share is calculated based on the per pupil allocations for the English learner and/or immigrant students enrolled in both public and participating nonprofit private schools. So the private school should receive an equivalent amount of products and services for each of the English learner and immigrant students served as the public school receives for each of its English learner and immigrant students, based on the per pupil allocation and student needs. Next slide, please. So one last note regarding Title III funding is that the LEA is paid in arrears, or in other words, reimbursed for its services to private school students. The CDE collects data in the CON-app on the number of nonprofit private school English learner and immigrant students served in the current year, and adds this number to the public school count when calculating the following year's award amount in order to reimburse LEAs for services provided to English learner and immigrant students. Next slide, please. So next up, we have Title IV. So the purpose of Title IV Part A is to provide students access to well-rounded educational opportunities, improve school conditions for student learning, and also improve the use of technology to improve academic achievement and digital literacy of all students. So services for private school students and teachers may focus on one or more of these areas. However, this must be determined through consultation with private school officials. And again, it must also be based on a needs assessment. One important thing to note is that the percentage requirements that apply to each of the Title IV program areas for LEAs that receive over $30,000 in Title IV funds does not apply to private schools. The percentage requirements only apply at the overall district level. And some examples of Title IV services are listed on the slide, such as college and career guidance counseling, school-based mental health services, and also professional development on the effective use of technology, just to name a few. Next slide, please. And here is a screenshot of the CDE's method of calculating equitable services proportional share document for Title IV. And like the samples shown for the other programs, it provides a walkthrough of the process for determining the equitable share amount. So for Title IV Part A equitable share, districts will determine a per pupil amount based on the district's total Title IV allocation, less administrative and indirect costs, and the total enrollment of both public and nonprofit private school students. And then at the bottom of the slide, we've also included the link to the CDE's Title IV webpage, which provides additional information on Title IV equitable services. And that concludes my section, so I will now turn it over to Bonnie.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, we want to finish up today by summarizing some of the things you've heard today and connecting those to some of the legal requirements, and also alerting you to some red flags that will tell you when there might be a problem that you might want to check into. So let's start out by looking at EDGAR. What is EDGAR? EDGAR is the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. First of all, to kind of back up, you'll find that requirements for equitable services are found in a number of different places. As you heard earlier, the requirements for Title I differ significantly from requirements for other programs, but there's also a lot that they have in common. So Title I requirements are actually found in the Every Student Succeeds Act under Title I. So there's a section in the Title I that speaks specifically about equitable services for Title I programs. There's also another section where you'll find equitable services addressed, and that's in Title VIII of ESSA. Title VIII is a sort of a general section that includes things about maintenance of effort and a variety of different topics that don't fit neatly into any of the program areas or that are cross-cutting. And in other words, they cover multiple programs. So Title VIII includes a section on the equitable services provisions for the other titles, all titles other than Title I. So those are two places where you'll find specific information. Also, you need to look to the program itself for guidance on use of funds for a particular program. What you can do is, you just heard from Rachel, under Title II is different from Title III. So that's another place you have to look. But many of the key requirements that apply to all programs are contained in the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, commonly referred to as EDGAR, which is found in Section 76, 650 through 667. Okay. We'll go through each of these requirements, but EDGAR just provides a nice summary of all the requirements that cut across programs. So we're going to go through each of these and look at some red flags. So first we'll look on the next slide at the first part of the this section of EDGAR that addresses district responsibilities. And in this section, it says that the district should provide a genuine opportunity for equitable services. And that often starts with, or that should start with, the notification of the opportunity to participate. And Rachel reviewed that. That means identifying eligible schools, contacting them, obtaining an intent to participate. So that's where this begins, and that's outlined in EDGAR. The section also advises district of the responsibility to develop a program for the private schools based on the number and needs of students. And it also clearly indicates that program development and administration of the program is a district responsibility. So that means the district must maintain control of the funds, property, and the program, such as purchasing, equipment inventory, reimbursement and payments to vendors. And we'll take a look at a few of those in the following slides. All right, next slide talks about consultation. So this is where some of the consultation requirements, again, Rachel addressed some of the required topics. Also in this section, though, they do remind you that consultation should take place before any decisions are made that affect the private school's opportunity to participate in the program. So that would include particularly two areas. One is transfer of funds. So funds are transferred under federal transferability, and those of you that just did the consolidated application saw that page where you have the ability to transfer funds out of Title II or Title IV into any other program or between those two programs. If the district decides to take advantage of federal transferability, there should be a conversation with the private school prior to that, because transferring those funds diminishes the ability of the private school to participate in the program to the degree you transfer the funds. So for example, if you transfer 100% of the funds out of Title IV into Title II, private schools would not be able to participate under Title IV, but they would have an increased share under Title II because the funds that are transferred would be part of that equitable share. Okay. The other area would be a decision to participate in eligible programs. If the district chooses not to participate, they should consult with the private school and let them know that they're planning not to participate in a particular program next year, either Title II or III for some reason. But because again, that impacts the private school's ability to participate. All right. So keep in mind, though, that while consultation is required for these and other topics, the final decision is with the district. So districts must provide an opportunity, and they must openly consider the views of the private school, but in the end, it's a district decision. All right. Genuine opportunity for private school officials to express their views comes in play under selecting third-party providers. In that case, again, the district has the final decision, but you consult with the private school on those topics. Okay, next slide has the next area, which has to do with the number and needs, the needs and number of students. So Edgar says that public schools and private school services, they must be comparable. However, if the needs are different, they should be addressed differently. And the number of students is generally defined by the program requirements. For example, how many students are served under Title III depends on how many students are and identify as English learners. Under Title I, how many are low achieving and residing in a Title I school attendance area. The benefits or the services are determined through consultation, and they may be different from what's in the public school, but they need to be comparable. So this is at the beginning, I mentioned the federal audit of California programs a number of years ago, where they found that the consultation was not taking place, and what they saw was that districts were just offering their services. You can come to our professional development, or you can participate in our program, rather than consulting and trying to design a program based on the needs of the private school. All right, next slide are some red flags. And we caution districts on using the appropriate selection criteria. And Adrian reviewed that selection criteria, but here are a few red flags where you know a district isn't using the correct criteria for identifying students for services. So if you're using free and reduced lunch or low income eligibility, if you're using that for identifying students for services, as Adrian pointed out in her example, that student would not be eligible for services based on poverty. The basis is on academic need for services. Another would be if a district is including any student, regardless of where they reside. So students, sometimes districts think that any student in their district would qualify. No, only if they reside in one of your Title I funded school attendance areas. Another red flag would be if you're using a single cut score to identify students for services, because as Adrian pointed out, this would be similar to a district targeted assistance program. And in that case, you need to have multiple objective academically related criteria that have been developed in consultation with the private school to identify students who are eligible for services. And finally, if you're using teacher judgment in grades 3 through 12, in grades K1 and 2, teacher judgment can be part of that criteria, but in the upper grades, they must be objective criteria. So just a few red flags that would signal that there's a problem with identifying students. Next, we'll take a look at the level of expenditures. A subgrantee, that means a district, shall spend the same average amount of funds on both your public and private school students. So that's how you come up with the equitable share. But according to Edgar, it's also based on consultation. So it may be a different average amount if the needs of the private school are different. Generally, that's not the case, and it's safer to have the same per pupil amount, but certainly if in consulting with the school, the needs are different, that funding might be adjusted somehow. All right, next we'll take a look at equipment and supplies. All right. Control over equipment and supplies can be problematic for many reasons, including the requirement that materials and supplies are not to benefit the private school. And that's in the section 76658 noted on there. It states that program funds are not to be used to finance the existing level of instruction or to otherwise benefit the private school. Instead, the funds are to meet the specific needs of eligible students. So when through consultation, the need for certain equipment or supplies is determined, how do you ensure administrative control? Again, they have to be under the control of the district. So first of all, the district needs to purchase these items. The private school can't purchase supplies or equipment and charge the district. They have to go through your purchase order process. The district also has to make sure they're labeled and on the district inventory as their property of the district, not the private school. And if they're used in the Title I program, you need to determine how are you going to ensure they're used only for Title I students. So if you have something that's sitting out all the time, how do you ensure that's not used for a general need to benefit the private school? In addition, remember that items purchased, particularly items of equipment, are not to be permanent fixtures for the private school. They must be removable without remodeling the school, as they should be able to be removed when the program is no longer there or they're no longer needed for the program. So they can't be permanent fixtures. One of the things to be careful of with equipment is that the longer the items are left at a private school, the private school begins to see them as their materials, their equipment. So we suggest that those materials be brought back for inventorying on an annual basis, and they don't just sit out at the school, but they come back annually and you check out, make sure those items are going to be used in the subsequent year's program. Next, district control of funds, again with personnel. So also related to the control of funds is the use of personnel to implement the program. So the program can be provided either through private school personnel who become either employees or contractors from the district, or public school personnel. If private school personnel are going to be involved in implementing the program, there are a few key things to remember. Number one, back to the basics, this is a district program. Even if you're using private school teachers, and therefore the services need to be under the control and supervision of the district. That means the program needs to be monitored, and that would involve program visits. How do you know what's going on if you're not monitoring the program? You're in control of the program, so there has to be some sort of oversight. Through consultation, the planned use of private school personnel should define the contract for services and ensure that the program and any professional development outside the regular hours of the private school staff members' regular duties. So for example, if you are going to have a private school personnel provide a service, then it's got to be outside their paid time as a teacher or a counselor or whatever at the school. So it's got to be outside their time. So it would have to be after school or something like that, clearly outside their time. And it would have to be through contract with the district. They become a contractor through your district contracting process. Again, staff, because funds can't be used to finance the existing level of instruction, you can't use you can't have pay for substitutes in a private school because that would be replacing their existing program. If the plans to use a public school, your district staff, the services being provided just have to be supplemental to the core instruction and for eligible students and through the consultation process. So you need to make sure that your staff are not providing core instruction and that they're providing us instruction to the appropriate students as you agreed upon through consultation. So 2 ways to go, but either way, they need to be supervised by the district. So either through contract with a private school employee or a public school personnel. All right, delivery of services. There's one coming up. All right. These are some important fiscal control reminders related to staff implementing the programs. Remember, private school teachers, again, hired, as we talked about earlier, outside their regular duty hours. And as we said, substitute teachers not allowed because that's a benefit to the school because they're providing the basic program. For workshops and conferences, the district can only reimburse the employee directly or to pay a vendor for the services. So a district cannot pay or reimburse a private school. So if you're paying for a conference or a workshop or a stipend, the private school can't say, oh, we already paid for it, just pay us back. You can never send funds to the private school. So the only 2 ways to do it, the employee can get reimbursed through the district. They can pay up front and they have to go through your district process, whatever your district reimbursement process, or you can pay the district can pay the vendor directly for that service. And again, stipends, if someone's attending a conference, you want to pay a stipend, it's only for time outside their regular hours. So outside the hours they would typically work and paid directly to the teacher. All right. Next, we'll look at the 3rd way that you can provide services, and that's through a contractor. And the key thing to remember is, first of all, you should work up the need through consultation, but the contract is between the district and the contractor. Okay? What should not happen is that the contractor and the private school consult and then come to you with a plan, because that's not based on you consulting about student needs and designing the program. So the way it should work is you talk with the private school, you consult with them, but what are the needs? You determine the needs, and based on that, you determine that a contractor might be the best way to provide that service. Then you, as the district, go back and find a contractor, either if you have to do an RFA, depending on the amount, your level at the district, if you have to go through that process, your own procurement procedures, you develop the RFA, and then also you need to include in the contract monitoring procedures. How are you going to monitor the contractor's work? You need to, if they're going to charge administrative costs, then they need to put that in the contract and identify that amount separately. You need to include program effectiveness measures from consultation. How are you going to determine if that contract service is effective? And it's your job to monitor that. You need to include language indicating the requirement for sufficient documentation prior to payment. So you shouldn't just be paying on a regular basis, like, well, we'll just pay you every month. No, the contractor needs to provide you something documenting the work that they've done, and then the payment goes out. So important to have that. List of deliverables by particular due dates. What do you expect that contractor to provide and by when? And it should include a statement that you will withhold payment if any of the requirements aren't met. And then there needs to be a process for them submitting their invoices, timelines, procedures, all that should be up front. So dealing with a contractor, I think a key thing to remember is the contractor and you make that agreement, you pay the contractor based on the needs identified through consultation. Red flags on the next slide, um, for lack of district control for services, private school officials signing timesheets. They're not the ones supervising. The district needs to supervise. So those timesheets should not be approved. They're not a district employee. They can't sign the timesheets. Another red flag is the contractor determines the areas of service. Contract says, oh, we'll do some services in this area, and we've talked with the private school and we know what they need here. And it's no, the private school consults with you. You identify what the areas of service are. Another red flag is with the LEA is not monitoring the program. How do you, who is someone going out there? How do you know what's going on? What process do you have to monitor? Communications like this, we've seen these in some popped up. Private school officials sending an email saying, I've arranged for professional development. The contract's attached. I'll send you the invoice. Okay, that's a problem in many ways, right? First of all, the consultation should have gone on with the district. The professional development should have been part of the consultation process. The contract needs to be negotiated with the district, not the private school. And sending you an invoice doesn't help because you are going to develop that contract and pay the contractor yourself. Okay? Another, if your private schools are sending you budgets, that shouldn't be happening because it's supposed to be you designing the program in consultation with the private school. So just a few red flags to keep in mind that show the district is not controlling the program. Next slide is funds not to benefit the private school. Okay. Funding is not for general use. Funding can't finance the existing level of instruction in the private schools or otherwise benefit the school itself. This sometimes is a tough one. It's a little easier with Title I and it gets a little more blurry with the other programs, but allowable uses need to be agreed upon and support implementation, including specific strategies to support eligible students to achieve outcomes determined through consultation. So in order to plan appropriate services, it requires an understanding of what is their existing level of instruction or what's their core program. What instruction, including services for English learners, and this sometimes is a problem that districts find they don't see a core program for English learners. So what are you supplementing? What services, equipment, PD are already in place? So you need to talk with them, consult with them so you know what's in place, so you know what you're supplementing. So anything else we missed here? Implementations, yes, defining the core. Okay, yeah. And this kind of fits too, not benefiting the private school, what we talked about equipment, that it can't be part of the school. It can't be like, it has to be removable because you're doing something to benefit the school, not specific to the students. Next slide is some more red flags. So the first three are particularly focused on Title I. So these are some problematic situations where the funds would benefit overall private school and not specifically the identified needs of the students. So first, a purchase of general items for general use in the school, such as library books, whiteboards for classroom use, computers, software placed in classrooms. Those are basically an overall benefit to the students in the school. So for Title I, that wouldn't be an allowable cost. It just needs to be based on the individual needs of the identified students. Other red flags, using Title I for general instructional or curricular workshops. So that wouldn't be appropriate for Title I. It might be more appropriate under Title II, but for Title I, it needs to be tied directly to the needs of the identified students. So a reading workshop, if you're doing tutors or working in reading, professional development in a reading program, but other more general needs would not fit under Title I. In all these instances, the actions would benefit the entire school or an entire classroom without regard to eligibility for services. So such uses of Title I would not focus on the targeted program designed through consultation to address the specific needs of Title I students at the private school. And they would they would benefit the private school and therefore not be allowed. All right. Next slide is inadequate program evaluation. This is an area that's often lacking. It's lacking in sometimes in our public school programs, but particularly in private schools. The evaluation should be part of consultation. The criteria should be determined ahead of time. You should have benchmarks to determine program effectiveness. And most importantly, the results of the evaluation should improve the program for the following year. A problem sometimes comes up is that a program just keeps rolling over and it's not found to be effective. The private school staff maybe like the program, but you need to show that it's effective. And I think finally we're coming to bypass. And that is just under Edgar, there's an opportunity for the state to take over the services if there's an issue and the consultation doesn't work between the district and the private school. We have never seen CDE. They are not anxious to do that. So most cases this doesn't happen. So we'll just skip over that one. Other fiscal requirements, just know that administrative costs, yes, you can apply administrative costs using the reasonable and necessary requirements, but also based on any caps that are for administration. Carryover, expected to obligate it in the current funds in the current year, and carryover should only be for any extenuating circumstances, and it needs to be used in the next year for equitable services support. Supplement supplant applies. We talk about you can't finance the existing level of instruction. We talked about transferability. Interagency agreement. If you have perhaps one or two students in a school outside your district and another district has a program operating there and they are willing to provide services to your students for Title I, you can do that, but only if you have a written interagency agreement and funds are transferred to provide for those services. Just a couple other reminders. All right. And finally, little things mean a lot. Yeah, your language is important in how you talk with the private school. The language we use can make a big difference in perception of both your public and your private school officials. While there might be a tendency to say things like that's the private school's program or the private school hasn't spent the funds, changing that to saying, talking about services provided through consultation, talking about materials and equipment that are on loan to the private school, and also about contractors, the private school's contractor or service provider. You talk about identified needs and services that might be provided through the contractor. So the bottom line is everything depends on the district. If the funds aren't spent, you can't say the private school didn't spend them because they're district funds. If the services aren't effective, it's a district program. So beginning with clear policies and procedures, transparent criteria for decision making, and setting a professional tone will go a long way to your success in working with your private school programs. So thank you for joining us today. Sorry to have kept you a few minutes over time, but please, here are some resources that might be helpful to you, and our contact information is on one of the final slides. Please contact us anytime that we can be of assistance to you, and we will send out a Q&A with any questions we didn't get answered today. Thanks so much, and take care of yourselves all.